Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Hi, welcome to the first Humanities from the Hill webinar series event. I'm going to take a second to try to make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Okay, I think I've got it. I'm Suzanne Delgizzo, Professor of English and Chair of the Center for Integrated Humanities at Chestnut Hill, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this first Humanities from the Hill webinar, which features Dr. David Contosta from the CHC History Department, and also Dr. Robert Meyer, who is from the Biology Department. And they're going to be talking to us today about the history and science of climate change. As attendees in this webinar, you are in sort of view-only mode. You can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. If you'd like to interact with us, we encourage you to do that by using the Q&A function. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, just scroll your cursor, your mouse cursor at the bottom of the screen, and you will see a Q&A icon with 2 dialog bubbles. You can use that to talk to us at any time, and feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. At the end of the presentation, we have some time to look through the questions. We'll prioritize questions that are asked more than once. Also, this session will be recorded, just so you know, so that we have memory of this and we can share it as an integrated humanities, I guess, resource going forward. So with that orientation behind us, let me just welcome our presenters. Dr. David Contosta is a professor of history at Chestnut Hill College. He has authored several books on urban history, including Suburb in the City, Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia. He is also co-author of Metropolitan Paradise, which is a multi-volume study of Philadelphia's Wissahickon Valley, which has recently been adapted as a documentary film called On the Wissahickon. Dr. Bob Meyer is a professor emeritus, newly minted, professor emeritus of biology at Chestnut Hill College, where he taught for over 40 years, or nearly 40 years, 2 years shy of 40 years, I think. He was also the director of the department's environmental studies program. And before I hand it over officially to David and to Bob, I want to give you a little preview of their talk. This is a map of where we're going today, and so you can get a sense of the arc of the presentation. And with all that behind us, I hand it over to Bob.
Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for showing up today. I'd like to start with a short, maybe 2 or 3 minute introduction about global warming itself. I think everybody has a pretty good idea of what global warming is about. You know that it has to do with carbon dioxide, and if you looked at the video we put up, you have even a better idea. But there's 2 points I really want to make, and the first one is that global warming is what we used to call the greenhouse effect in the old days. And the greenhouse effect is actually a natural occurrence on the planet. In fact, the Earth would be in worse shape if we didn't have a greenhouse effect. In the days before human beings, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was supplied there from volcanic eruptions and other kind of seismic activity. And that extra layer of, or I shouldn't call it a layer, but that extra amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere helped to take the energy of the sun and sort of trap it next to the planet. And that's kept the Earth at a nice, comfortable temperature for life. So, this is not something that's completely artificial. Global warming, to a certain extent, is a natural phenomenon. Where it becomes unnatural, and David, I'm sure we'll talk about this right after me here, is when we started mining fossil fuels and burning fossil fuels and became a fossil fuel economy and ended up releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, the second point is that I wanted to just say about how global warming transitions to climate change. I mean, some people use them interchangeably. It's not exactly the same thing. Global warming is a slow, progressive warming of the planet. And the air on the planet, the water on the planet, Um, and it adds energy to weather systems. So when we have a hurricane, and we've been seeing the effects of some of these in the past decade, when we have a big tropical storm or a hurricane, those weather systems take energy, especially from the ocean. So even going up a degree in temperature in the ocean is a huge amount, because you're talking about a huge area, is a huge amount of energy that now gets funneled into that wind system. So even small global warming changes can produce large meteorological effects. Also, the planet doesn't heat equally. The poles have been heating faster than the rest of the planet. And you may think, well, that's not a problem. It's so damn cold up there anyway. What's a few more degrees? Except that the jet stream, which is sort of a border between the polar cold air and the southern warm air in the United States, becomes very loose and fluctuating under those conditions. It's almost less powerful, and so it creates huge fluctuations. And so that's why lately we've been seeing things like Alaska having winters where there's no snow, or you get really, like we've seen some pretty cold winters, not this past year, but before that. It depends on the fluctuations of the jet stream. Sometimes we can be shoved into a big cold dip or into a very warm upwelling. And those fluctuations are just going to become more and more erratic as both the poles actually warm up. So it's a natural thing, and it's really about energy. It's about how much energy is being trapped in the earth and how that energy gets funneled or transferred into our weather systems. But the main key is carbon dioxide release. And to get into that, and we'll do most of that today, we're going to talk, I'll let David get started on talking a little bit about the history of industrialization and some of the precursors of that big burst of CO2.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Bob. The human impact on global warming or climate change begins in a large way, or at least begins, so far as we're concerned, in the middle 1700s, first in England and then in Western Europe, then in the United States and around much of the rest of the world with the so-called Industrial Revolution. And what happens here is that water power and wind power and muscle power, either with human muscles or animal muscles, is replaced with coal-burning steam engines. And it's steam engines that are going to propel the early Industrial Revolution. They burn huge amounts of coal, and that, of course, throws a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. I was also reading that the Industrial Revolution may have had an impact on population, and I don't want to steal Bob's thunder here, but one of the side effects of industrialization was a mechanization of agriculture, increasingly as we get into the 19th century. So more food at lower prices is produced. This leads to better nourishment. It leads to longer life, less infant mortality, and so forth. And I'll talk about another effect, I think, on population as I go on here, talking about the Industrial Revolution. From time to time, I'm going to reference the Philadelphia area because I think that's a way of bringing it home to us if you're familiar with this area. The Schuylkill Navigation Canal from Pottsville to Philadelphia opens in 1825, and we know most of it knows as the Manioc Canal. And coal comes down from the anthracite fields along the canal, and then in 1842, the Reading Railroad also brings coal down into Philadelphia. And these railroads, of course, were powered by coal-fired steam engines. And the railroads were tremendous consumers of iron and steel, and the iron and steel is turned out in these coal-fired blast furnaces. And don't forget about steamships and steamboats, which are also burning coal. To get some idea of the soot and pollution that resulted, there's a photograph that I've used in one of my books called Darkness at Noon, And it's a picture of downtown Pittsburgh at noon with all the lights on. It looks as if it's midnight. And for a while, people saw these smokestacks as symbols of progress, symbols of prosperity. The vast railroad networks that were created across the United States and in other countries of the world created mass markets, which increased demands for manufactured goods, which again leads to the burning of more coal in order to turn out these goods. We also think that having this rapid means of transportation distributed food more evenly. There were often bad crops in places or even famines, but with rail network, that could be alleviated. So this is another reason perhaps that population is going to increase. There's also the earlier agricultural revolution with crop rotation and using manure and also planting clover to restore nitrogen to the soil. In the late 19th and early 20th century, we have the emergence of electricity as a way of lighting people's homes and even of powering machinery and of making items in factories. But unfortunately, electricity is going to be generated with coal. And until recently, it was almost all generated by coal, and a great deal of it still is generated by coal. And this is producing carbon dioxide, which of course is a greenhouse gas, and it's adding then to global warming. At the same time, and this is a kind of a perfect storm, at the same time, we have the appearance of gasoline-powered internal combustion engines for trucks and cars. And later on, I'm going to talk about cars more vis-a-vis suburban sprawl. The first cars show up in Philadelphia in the 1890s. There aren't very many of them, but they do show up at that point. Also in 1903, the Wright brothers used one of these lighter internal combustion engines to create powered flight for the first time. And later on, we have jet aircraft. And so aviation throws a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere increasingly all the time. One of the things that we talked about in the seminar, Bob and I, is that there's this desire for greater and greater abundance. Presidents think they're failures if they can't increase the GDP by 3 or 4% a year. And if you think that we can do that and compound it year after year after year, we're going to be in a lot of trouble, because the only way to do that is to burn more fossil fuels, or at least one of the ways to do that is burn more fossil fuels and contribute further to the greenhouse effect. I'll just end my portion here by saying that 121 years ago in 1899, an American geologist named Thomas Chowder Chamberlain published a paper in which he predicted that increasing CO2 in the atmosphere would lead to global warming. So this is not a new discovery. This is not a new idea. We're going back just a little over 120 years. No one paid any attention to it, of course. And we were in the full force of what some people call the second industrial revolution. So Bob is going to talk about population growth and how it contributes to global warming and climate change.
Okay, thanks, David. I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone that we have an enormous amount of people on the planet. And most of this growth has occurred within a very short period of time, within, say, the past 200 years. I mean, it took, I have a couple of statistics here. It took the entire lifespan of the human race up until 1800, roughly, to get our first billion people on the planet. We got the second billion in 124 years. We got the third billion in 33. We got the fourth billion in 15. And the fifth, sixth, and seventh billions all took only 12 years to accumulate. We're on our way to our eighth right now. We're at about 7.8 billion right now. If we'd still have 1 billion people on the planet, most of the problems that we have would go away. A lot of the industrialization impacts that David was talking about would be handleable if we had only 1 billion people on the planet. So the population is a concern. One of the reasons the human population shot up is the advent of industry, but also a number of things too. Agriculture, and that's going back a bit from the Industrial Revolution, but agriculture, better nutrition, vaccines, antibiotics, one that people don't appreciate very much, public sanitation, saves huge numbers of lives and pushes our lifespan upwards. So we have a situation way in the past where we had high rates of birth and high rates of death because there were all sorts of ways to die. And those two things balanced out pretty well. And that's why the first billion took so long to accumulate. But once we start eliminating or dealing with ways to die, once we start increasing our lifespan, we don't automatically stop having babies. So there's a lag period there. So the population is having babies at the same rate, but people aren't dying as fast as they used to. So we launch into this huge upward spike of population. Now it's not, I want to put this caveat out there. It's not just population that's important. In ecology, we have a formula that says that that ecological impact is a function of population, affluence, and technology. It's not just a matter of how many people you have in a country. It's a matter of what each person in that country is consuming. So that affluence is really another term for consumption. Just to make, this was true a few years ago. I don't know if these numbers are still as true, but the carbon footprint of a baby in India is about 1/100th of the carbon footprint of an American baby. And that's not just because there's, that's not because there's some biological difference between these babies. One is going to be brought up in a culture of affluence and the other is not, on average. And the amount of consumption and the amount of fossil fuels you have to burn to supply those consumer goods and supply that consumption is going to be much, much greater in an industrialized nation than in a non-industrialized nation. And it's also level of technology too. As your technology levels increase, the amount of fossil fuel usage increases right along with them. So as industry gets more and more prevalent and spreads around the globe, carbon dioxide levels go up, but also population goes up too. Now, there's some good news, a little bit of good news, and part of what I wanted to talk about was good news. Population levels are starting, or I shouldn't say levels, population rates of increase are starting to slow down. In fact, they started to slow down in the 60s. So we're no longer increasing geometrically. We've started to back off of that. That's why the last 3 decades, it took us 12 years, 12 years, and 12 years to add a billion, a billion, a billion. That sounds terrible, but we didn't go down to 8. We didn't go down to 6, all right? It's bottomed out. And there's a lot of good evidence lately that, in fact, we're going to be looking eventually at a decline in human population. Now, when that's going to occur isn't particularly clear. The UN's prediction, which is the one you see written up most often, says that by 2100, we should have about 11 billion people on the planet, and that'll be it. But newer studies, especially one that was just in the Lancet, have really pulled that back. I've seen people making predictions by 2064, we'll have 9.7 billion, and that'll be it. And we'll start going down from there. I even saw one that said by 2040, this person didn't even think we were going to get to 9 billion before we'd start going down. There's been a huge drop in fertility across the planet. And there's some reasons for that. In fact, there's a number of them, but I think the 2 most important ones are that children have become an expense in an industrial economy. When you move from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, people move into the cities. It's no longer, you don't need 12 kids to run the farm anymore. In fact, 3 kids is expensive because now you've got to educate them, you've got to provide for them. So while having kids is cheap and maybe even necessary in an agrarian economy, in an industrialized economy, it's expensive. and that's starting to kick in. The other probably best indicator, if you look at different countries, the best indicator of a decline in birth rate is the education and opportunities given to women. Educating women, giving them career opportunities, giving them control over their own bodies. Once a country starts down that route, babies drop off. Now, there's other things too. Social services for the elderly are good, so we no longer need a bunch of kids to take care of us when we're older. We have social services in some cases that take care of that. Improved birth control, that kind of ties in, I guess, with the sort of emancipation of women. But improved access and effectiveness of birth control is a big factor too. There's even some ones that are a little off the radar here, and I thought I'd mention them because David always likes these two.
Don't blame it on me, Bob.
There's been a lot of talk recently about microplastics and how they're in the water, they're in the air, we're eating and drinking them constantly. This is pretty new. These are microscopic pieces of plastic that are produced from the deterioration of larger pieces of plastic. A lot of these microplastics break down very slowly, but when they do break down, they often produce compounds that are hormonal mimics. And there's some thought that we may be, in fact, screwing up our reproductive systems, lessening sperm count, lessening female fertility by this constant deluge of plastics, that we're internalizing. Now, a lot of work, don't go home and tell your kids about that. A lot of work needs to be done about that yet. So,
in other words, don't use that as a birth control technique, right, Bob?
Just start chewing on your plastic bottles.
Right.
No, but I thought that was that's always I think is an interesting idea. The other one, and David and I talked about this in our seminar, is that there seems to be, at least in the United States and in some other countries, what is called the sex recession. Young people don't seem to be as interested or feel it's as necessary to have sexual relationships or with others. This might tie into the fact that a lot more women are more interested in their own selves right now, and their ability to, get educated and have careers. But there evidently is a sort of, to go along with the drop in birth rate, this sort of drop in interest. Now, again, that's new, all right? That's tentative. But I thought I'd mention it because it's also very interesting. The world fertility rate right now is about, I think it's about somewhere around 2.5, 2.1, 2.5. And that doesn't mean anything to you unless you know that 2.1 is the sort of the cutoff point. If everybody on the planet, if every woman on the planet had 2.1 children, that would be considered replacement rate. Now, the 0.1 is because there's always some infant mortality, and so you have to have a slightly more children than you have parents, or to make up for infant mortality. But 2.1 is the cutoff. If you fall below 2.1, you're heading for a decline. China right now is at 1.5. Brazil's at 1.8. We would be less than 2.1 without immigration. We still, I couldn't find an exact number where somebody took that part away, but the predictions are, the UN predicts that by 2050, it'll be 2.2 across the world. And a study by the University of Washington had, by 2100, it'll be 1.7 worldwide. So we're looking at a downturn, which can be good. I'm not going to get into the bad reasons, but I think the bad reasons of a rapid downturn in population are obvious. We have an aging population and nobody to support them, and that in a nutshell is the bad part of this. And why? And when a downturn like this happens rapidly, that can be a problem.
It's already happening in places like Korea and China. They're really concerned about it, the low birth rates.
Yeah, and Japan too, I think. I mean,
Japan also, yes.
Yeah, there's just so, I mean, our medicine has gotten so much better that we're living longer. So we're going to get to the point where there's more retirees than there are people working, and that's not economically sustainable unless some kind of plan is put into place.
Where will my Social Security come from?
Yeah, well, I don't know, David. You and I might be lucky enough, but I don't think our kids are going to be in a good position for that. Okay, so some good news there. Environmentally, numbers dropping. Economically, there could be problems. So I'm going to bring it back over to David, and David's going to talk a little bit about suburban and urban sprawl. Urban/suburban sprawl, and some of the strategies for dealing with that.
Right. I want to talk about urban and suburban sprawl as causative factors in global warming. And I'll just begin by talking about the older railroad suburbs that occurred in the late 19th century. And actually, Chestnut Hill is a good example. I call it a suburb in the city, but it's essentially a suburban community. And you can think of many of these older railroad suburbs around here. And they did not result in sprawl because people were as lazy then as they are now. They wanted to live within walking distance of the railroad station. But with the advent of cheap automobiles, people are able to venture further and further out. Railroads are expensive to build, and you can't bend the railroad tracks at the last minute if you want to start a new development someplace. But if there's a farm road going out, then the developers can put up houses almost anywhere that they want, and people can use cars to get back and forth. In a way, we could begin in 1913 when Henry Ford starts building the Model T Ford on an assembly line, and by the mid-1920s, you could buy a Model T Ford brand new for less than $500. The advent of automobile suburbs is blunted somewhat by the Depression of the 1930s and by World War II, and then there's an explosion after World War II. And there are a number of factors here that I think explain this. One is redlining. Partly it was racial redlining, but the FHA, which was created during the New Deal so that people who were of modest income could afford houses, redlined certain areas of cities and didn't want banks to lend money because they thought the real estate would fall in value, and if they had to repossess the property, they'd lose out on it. And the Veterans Administration did the same thing after World War II. They guaranteed payback of loans. There were low down payments and so forth, but they also redlined areas in cities and encouraged the GIs to build houses or buy houses out in the suburbs, out in the automobile suburbs. There's also lobbying, and it begins in the 1930s and it continues into the post-World War II period, against public transportation and in favor of highways and roads. And the lobbying is done by oil companies, auto manufacturers, and realtors. And there are a number of instances in which General Motors would go into a community and say, we're going to sell you some buses here very cheaply at a discount. And while we're at it, we'll tear up the trolley tracks for you. Which means, of course, they're not going to be able to bring the trolleys back online. Post-war governments invest in roads and highways and not in public transportation. And this has to do with the fact that people who own cars often, not always, New York would not be a good example of this, but people who own cars were often more affluent. So the local congressperson is going to listen to someone who has enough money to buy a car and maintain a car than someone who takes the bus. There are also unintended consequences of zoning. In fact, almost all of what we're talking about is a good example of unintended consequences. People didn't start the Industrial Revolution saying, we're going to cause global warming as a result of doing this. Zoning comes to Philadelphia in the 1930s and a lot of places in the 1930s. And the idea was to separate residential areas from commercial areas and so forth. But one of the consequences of this was that it became illegal to mix not only residential with commercial, but to mix lot sizes and house sizes. Chestnut Hill would be illegal. The main street in Chestnut Hill would be illegal now under most zoning because you wouldn't be allowed to have a store with apartments on the top. There are also zoning practices that lead to pods. there's an educational pod, there's a shopping center pod, there are residential pods, and as a result, children can't walk to school. Everybody has to take the bus to school. There's also fragmentation of land use planning. In Pennsylvania, there are 2,500 municipalities, and I'm counting townships here, and they all have control over land use, and they don't have to consult with one another. The counties can only recommend. So the local municipalities can allow almost whatever they want, and there's going to be a terrible duplication. Because people are depending on automobiles to get around in suburbs, one has to drive everywhere. Shopping, school, church, recreation. It's kind of ludicrous when you think that people drive to go to the gym, or they drive somewhere to take a hike, because that's the only way they can get there. There's a decline in what we used to call the walking town and the walking city. Believe it or not, cities and towns were once laid out on a pedestrian scale because people wanted to be able to walk to work. They wanted to be able to have their kids walk to neighborhood schools. They wanted to walk to church. They wanted to walk to visit their friends and relatives, and that was all disrupted in the automobile suburb craze of the post-World War II, and I think it's had some really deleterious social consequences. There's a paucity of bike lanes and walking paths in suburban areas, and this isn't really relevant, but I wanted to say something about it. There are millions and millions of acres of emerald green lawns in suburban areas. That becomes the dream, and you get these grass seed catalogs and so forth, and fertilizing catalogs in the mail every spring. People are burning huge amounts of gasoline in order to mow these lawns. It would be better if they would plant in trees and shrubs and other kinds of ground cover. There are some good signs, though, I think, and some alternative possibilities. New York City, as you may have read in the New York Times this last weekend, is going to close off certain streets to traffic permanently. A lot of people were really happy about the falling off of traffic in New York during the virus. Some streets are going to be closed off entirely, and one idea is not to allow private passenger cars at all below about 65th Street in New York. They're even planning a pedestrian and bicycle bridge across the East River, and these are serious plans. Young people, too, are not as interested in cars. They're probably not as interested in cars, maybe for the same reason that I'm interested in sex. No, I don't know whether that's the same reason or not, but they don't seem to be car crazy. I can remember people parking their cars and buffing them and caressing them and wanting other people to see them, thinking that it would mean that they were cool or whatever. That seems to be dying off to some extent. And then finally, there's the Garden City movement that actually began in England in 1898 with Ebenezer Howard. And the Garden City model is very different from the automobile suburbs in the post-World War II period. The Garden Cities were maybe 20, 25 miles outside of a large metropolis, and they were surrounded by fields and forests, and there were commuter rail lines between these garden cities to, let's say, a place like London or Birmingham. And there were some communities that were modeled after the garden cities here in the United States. One was Wyomissing, which is west of Reading, and it was created by the owners of the Berkshire textile mills there, and some of you may have been there to the outlets. It was designed by John Nolan, and he was very much influenced by the Garden City movement. Perhaps one that you know more about are the Woodward houses and Woodward developments on the west side of Chestnut Hill. It's really enfolded in the Wissahickon Creek and tributaries thereof. So it has forest, and it also has a lot of open space and fields too that were provided. And it's a railroad suburb so that people could take the train in and out. Celebration, Florida, and Seaside, Florida are also examples of new urbanism or new suburban communities. So suburban sprawl is a major contributor to climate change and to global warming. And I won't go on and on here, but there are not very many people now, many more people now living in the greater Philadelphia area than there were 35 years ago. They're just simply spreading over more and more space, the same number of people spreading over more and more space. And I think that's a good example of what sprawl is about. So Bob is going to tell us about new energy sources, and there'll be some hopeful signs here, I think.
Okay. Well, I had generated a list of sustainable energy sources. You might want to call them green sources of energy. And it became obvious while I was doing some reading that I can't talk about each of these in 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is try and summarize a little bit. Let me at least mention some of the different kinds of renewable, sustainable sources of energy. There's ones that I think people are very familiar with, like solar energy. You can see the windmills on the slide here, wind energy. Hydroelectric we've had for a very long time. Since man could put rocks in the water and make a dam, they've been using hydropower. But there's also some other ones that are a little newer. Geothermal energy, where we can tap the heat energy of the planet. Biofuels, where we can actually extract fuels from living organic matter, well, not had been living organic matter, instead of digging out fossil fuels from the ground. What else do we have here? Wave generation is a new one. This is one where you use the motion of the tides or the motion of waves in the ocean to actually generate electricity. And also hydrogen cells is a relatively new one. Here you use, and hydrogen cells are more along the lines of what you would replace something that was battery operated with. Hydrogen cells are literally a different kind of battery. You don't have to really burn any fuel at all while it's running. You put hydrogen and oxygen in it, and water comes out the other side, and you generate electricity that way. Well, like I said, I can't talk about them all. So let me talk about one of the ones that seem the most promising up to this point. And maybe if there's a little extra time, I'll talk about why some of them aren't so promising. Right now, the ones that are growing the fastest worldwide are solar and wind. Solar energy has grown I pulled some data from the International Renewable Energy Agency. And from 2010 to 2018, solar energy generation of electricity increased by 17 times, well, almost 18 times. Now, that's not percent, that's times, 17-fold. Wind is about, in that same time period, increased about 4-fold. All of the others are less than a 2-fold increase over that 9-year period. Hydroelectricity is by far the largest contributor to renewable energy, because we've had hydroelectric dams for quite a long while. Now, they have their own problems, they do. I made a sort of quick calculation here, and it seems like right now, if you want to look worldwide, we're probably using these systems. We're probably generating about, I would say, 12% of the world's energy is coming out of these. So that leaves a whopping, 88% that are still due to fossil fuels. What's great about these, and there are great things about all of these possibilities. What's good about them is that almost all of them are renewable, essentially non-polluting, sustainable. But when it comes to things like auxiliary pollution or other environmental impacts or cost, then some of these fall by the wayside. Solar energy and wind energy are both renewable and sustainable. They don't generate any real pollution, but they're non-constant. Wind stops, sun goes down for the night. You can offset some of that with battery systems, but we don't really have the kinds of batteries we need at this point to deal with that problem. What happens now is that when the wind stops and the sun goes down for the night, if we have to, we go back on the grid. So these things are hooked into the grid. They take weight off of the grid, off of the fossil fuel grid. But when they can't function, you have to go back on the grid again. Wind has a very small land footprint, which is a good kind of a thing. But it's also gets pushed back because I don't know if you've ever sat near a windmill. They're relatively noisy, and many people find them aesthetically displeasing. That I don't count. I mean, for me, that would not count as any kind of a real argument, but it is one. There's a lot of not in my backyard problems with wind power. People are all for it as long as they can't see them, and they're big and they're tall, and you have to see them if you're going to use them. For both solar and wind power, wind is expensive to set one of these up, but the costs are dropping. And once it's set up, you're essentially home free. You have to do maintenance and things like that, but you would have to do that on any kind of a system. Hydroelectricity, which is the widest used renewable, most used in China, then Canada, then Brazil, then the US. Those are the 4 top users of hydroelectricity. What's nice about it is it's relatively constant. At night, the streams and rivers, they keep flowing the same as they did during the day, and they don't function based on whether the wind is blowing or not. Now, on a bad year or a good year, you might get more or less flow, but they're relatively constant as a source. Unfortunately, they do a lot of environmental damage on their own. Large dams like the Hoover Dam and some of these big ones from the past decrease water quality. They get in the way of fish migration. They destroy habitats or damage habitats for other organisms. And in the United States, we've pretty much used up all the good spots. In the United States, construction of dams is drying up. They have a pretty large startup cost, as you might imagine. But right now, this is not a real growth type of a deal. In fact, in that 2010 to 2018 period, they only went up by 1.2 times the amount of energy generated by hydroelectricity. So it has its limitations. Let me see how my time is doing here. Yeah. Okay. A couple of more minutes. Geothermal. I have geothermal in my house. Works great. Local home geothermal is a big difference from industrial geothermal. You usually dig deeper into the warmer layers of the earth for industrial geothermal. It's a much, much larger cost outlay. It does have a pretty small land footprint, and it does have really massive potential. But geothermal has only gone up about 1.3 times in that 9-year period I was talking about. The costs are lowering, but they're still very expensive. There's heavy upfront costs here. For this, a lot of the tech needs to get better. They can be very location specific too. Iceland runs just about its whole country on geothermal energy, but they're sitting on top of a rift in the crust of the planet. They have constant heat coming up and constant seismic activity. So they'd be foolish not to use it, and they do use it, and they use it well. But this isn't going to work all over the world. Wave generation, high cost, vulnerable to things like storms. And it also negatively impacts marine ecosystems. It's mostly being developed in the US and the UK and Australia. A little bit in Portugal too. But its big problem is it's one of the newer ones. So its big problem is its technological cost at this point. They're still trying to figure out how to bring the cost down. Now, the only one I haven't mentioned are biofuels and hydrogen cells, and I've got like 2 seconds here, so let me do that. Biofuels are fuel made from biomass. Like if I cut down a field of grass, I can actually change that. I can chemically alter that material and extract biofuels from it, like ethanol or some of the other alcohols. You can grow fuel crops in places where food crops can't grow. That's a benefit. while they're growing, they actually capture carbon from the air too. So it's more of a cycle than it is dumping constant carbon into the air. There's a reduced chance of environmental disasters. You can't very well have a corn spill, where like you can an oil spill. The trouble is there's land use issues. If we changed all of our energy needs to biofuels, we would not have enough land on the planet to serve us. It just takes up too much space. So while it can be a good supplement, a green supplement, but it's not going to solve the problem. I'll take 2 seconds to talk about hydrogen cells because they're kind of sexy and hot right now. Hydrogen cells are a deal where you literally take hydrogen gas and oxygen, put them into the same, and I won't tell you how it works, it's tedious. Put them into the same battery or the same cell. They combine, release energy, and you generate electric current. And when they combine, the waste product is water. So it sounds great, except that it's really difficult to extract hydrogen from the other compounds that it's usually attached to. You can get hydrogen anywhere. The trouble is it doesn't occur by itself anywhere. It occurs attached to other molecules. Water is the most obvious choice. You can electrolytically split water, but then you have to generate that electricity from somewhere. Which means right now, burning fossil fuels to make hydrogen so that you can put a hydrogen cell in your car to save CO2, which you didn't really do anyway because you burned fossil fuels to make the hydrogen. And it is expensive. It's hard to transport. It's hard to store. There is not a good supporting infrastructure for it too right now. So if you're out driving and, my hydrogen fuel cell's low, you're not gonna be able to pull up somewhere and have them fill it up with hydrogen. So that's on the outskirts of still being developed. It might have some really good possibilities. It might have some good applications, but it's not going to be the answer, I think, to global warming and CO2 output. All of these things are potentially useful, especially if we combine them and use them all at the same time. The most ones we should probably be putting our time into is wind and solar. And that's happening. I mean, that's really increasing. In 1 year in the United States, solar energy went up twofold between 2017 and 2018, which is a big jump. So we still have, there's still things that have to be done with this, and there's still technology that has to be worked out. But I think the technology is probably here. A lot of it just requires political will at this stage of the game to make this shift, which isn't going to be easy because you've got large, especially in this country, you've got large fossil fuel lobbies that are fighting tooth and nail not to have this stuff take place because it would mean the end of their industries. So some good news. And I don't want to leave on a, this sounds bad, but I don't want to leave it on an overly optimistic note. And I think David would probably agree with me. We're in trouble. If we had another 200 years to work this out, that's one thing, but we don't have we may have a decade or two to really get this under control. There's some signs of hope, but there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of minds to be changed before I think we're going to work our way out of our climate change problems. I don't know, David, I don't know if you want to agree with that or disagree.
Well, no, I agree with that too. And much of what has happened is an unintended consequence. But we humans did this to ourselves. And because we've done it to ourselves, we theoretically, through science and public policy, can do something about it. But we need to change the way we live. And that's very difficult to do. If I give any piece of advice, I would say, if you're concerned about climate change, vote, vote, vote for politicians who are concerned about it also.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can recycle all you want. You can drive your Prius. It's not going to work. The only things that's going to work are large systemic changes, and those have to be legislated. Voting is the most important thing you can do for climate change. I agree. So I think we're done, Suzanne.
Yes, I think
You
so.
take some questions.
Hi, just unmuting myself. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Yes, you look at, you're fine.
Good. All right. So, yeah, I think maybe the question that I have is about economics and environmentalism. It seems like the two don't meet. In fact, they're sort of contradictory and they pull us in different directions. So is there anything that you might say or remark upon about how do we move past the economic obstacles to a more sort of environmentally friendly approach to the world that we live in?
I think that environmental changes can, in fact, create a lot of jobs. The Green New Deal promises to do that. So I don't think we have to sacrifice one for the other. And I know one of the opposition to doing anything about climate change is because people don't want the government controlling the economy. They don't want the government controlling business. We can't even get people to wear masks in this country. So getting people to do something about the environment is going to be really difficult. One panacea people talk about is electric cars. The problem is, how's the electricity for the cars going to be generated? Is it going to be generated with fossil fuels? But I think a lot of cities are deciding that they're going to dampen down on the car culture. They're going to tax people for coming into the city. They're going to clear cars off the streets in large metropolitan areas. And it may take another 15 years to do that, if we have 15 years. Bob?
There have been studies that have shown that there is lots of economic potential in green technology. I think a lot of it boils down to people having an aversion to change, because it's going to mean learning new things. It's going to mean training for different kinds of jobs. Every time we've had a technological, sea change, there's always been people pushing back against it, and claiming that this is gonna ruin the economy, and but every technological change brings with it new opportunities too. It's just a matter of getting people to buy into the idea that this could be economically feasible. Some of these things are just in their infancy too. They're going to be, technologies that are in their infancy are expensive. But I think there's plenty of evidence that this will work if you can manage to get people to change attitude about it.
I think people don't want to believe in climate change because they can't see it. It's not as if they do something now that's going to kill them in the next hour or the next 2 or 3 days. But we did wean millions of people off smoking in a relatively short period of time. So
that's true.
Sign.
If we wait for a crisis, a real crisis to occur, it'll be too late. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't motivate unless there's a crisis in their face.
Yeah, we human beings are not,
David was saying, we have a crisis in our face right now and we can't motivate people.
We human beings are not good about projecting very far into the future. We probably evolved to do fight or flight, and not to plan 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line when we might be dead, might not be here.
Yeah, Keely McCarthy is agreeing with what you're saying here, saying that there is the potential to align, and I think we all agree. Economics with environmentalism is just how do you bring about that change in hearts and minds, and hopefully we don't wait for a crisis to do that, to really be the impetus for that. We also have a comment from Matthias Klang, who says, as consumers, we are often told to change our behavior to save the environment. But is this a form of misdirection? Is it the consumer or industry that needs to change? Obviously, they're interconnected.
Well, it's the tragedy of the commons that we're talking about here, and Bob and I got into it in class. People are going to say, well, he over there, she over there is not going to change, so why should I, and why should I sacrifice? So individuals changing is not going to do the trick. We have to have some kind of governmental and social policy. And in this country, people like to scream rugged individualism. No one's going to tell me what to do. And that's going to be difficult to overcome.
And I think it is a form of misdirection too, because one of the things we talked about in class was the big littering campaign that occurred back when we were kids.
Yes.
And everybody remembers the Indian there that's crying, and the people who funded that were the plastics people.
Yes.
Because they wanted to push the responsibility for the plastic pollution onto the consumer instead of making less things out of plastic. So if they could convince the consumer it was up to them to pick up after themselves, it was up to them to recycle, then there's so much emphasis placed on recycling now that everybody forgets about the third R, the one that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is reduce.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is fairly deliberate.
I'd like to chime in there with Barbara Longquist's comment then, because she says, how can we rethink the very notion of prosperity? She's also concerned about the election where our current president promises energy and suggests his opponent will take it away. But I would think maybe we could stick with that first part. Do you think we need to sort of reconsider what it means to be a prosperous country or to be individually comfortable? Or what are your thoughts on that?
As I suggested, it's a political problem, and it's a Wall Street problem. If a president does not raise the GDP, and of course presidents really don't have that much control, but if the GDP doesn't go up 3 or 4 or 5%, then the president's afraid that the voters are going to boot him or her out of office. So that's a real problem. And stock prices won't go up on Wall Street if the company doesn't grow by 2 or 3 or 4% a year. So the politicians and the businesses are really hooked into growth. And people even say, wouldn't it be a tragedy if my children weren't wealthier than I? This is the first generation in American history when the next generation isn't going to be as prosperous. It's not true, by the way, because in the 1930s, people weren't as prosperous maybe as their parents were. But we're hooked into this growth, 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 growth. That's what we need to do.
Well, and I think you're hooked into I won't say insurmountable problem, but a very large problem there too. Unless we figure out a way to do it differently, we have countries now that are full of people that want to have the same standard of living as the United States. It can't be done. Not with the way we're doing it now. If you brought every country on the planet up to the consumption level of the United States, that'd be the end. That would be totally unsustainable. Now, what that means is, and you can't go to a place, to a third world country and say, look you guys can't get up to our level because it would destroy the planet. They're not going to listen to that.
Yes.
I think Barbara has a point, and you too, Suzanne. We have to reconfigure what it means. What a prosperous life means. I'm losing my words. What a life that we can be satisfied. What a satisfying life means.
And it's not more and more.
Yeah, go ahead.
Money. It's not more and more property. That does not bring happiness, and yet people think it does.
You can't do it the way we've been doing it, and yet when I think about, all right, well then let's just get everybody in the United States to do with less. I think, oh my God, how is that going to work?
Well, what about the COVID moment though? Because one of the articles that you sent around for us to look at before the webinar suggested the huge changes in pollution levels because of COVID-19. So do you think we're going to see any lasting environmental effects from this sort of enhancement of the virtual in our lives? Do you think there's any stickiness to this?
I'd like to
I think you're going to see it. You're going to see it going back up again. Maybe not as bad as it was, but I hate to sound cynical, but I think once the governors are off, it'll be back to business as usual.
Yeah, CO2 levels went down about 17%.
Yeah, it was impressive.
And if you notice the car advertisements now, one of them says, "You want to make up all those miles you didn't drive."
Yeah.
And the other one plays the song "On the Road Again." And they want you to think that you'll get in touch with yourself, that you'll feel free, you'll feel creative. if you only get into the car, and the car is always driving on a road where there aren't any other cars, interesting enough.
Yeah.
But I think they're desperate to get people back into cars. And I'm not sure that people are going to abandon that kind of automobile lifestyle. So maybe electric cars are the future, but we need to generate the electricity from non-fossil fuels.
And to tell you the truth, I don't think people can abandon it. I mean, yes, we were forced to for 4 or 5 months now, but without some kind of real systematic change, people are going to be forced to go back to driving their cars and forced to go back to, their lifestyles again in some sense.
Yeah.
So
Most cities don't have a good public transportation infrastructure. I've looked at maps of the subway system as projected in Philadelphia in the 1920s. There were going to be numerous subway lines. They built 2 of them, the Broad Street and the Market Street line, and then abandoned the whole project. And we know that American railways are a disgrace in comparison to those in Japan and in most European cities because of this love affair of the car, because of the lobbying, because we just don't have the will to deal with it.
Well, we're up on the hour, and I have a sort of a formal sign out, but I do want to acknowledge Melissa's question. She said, David, what is your next book? Will you have anything else on Chestnut Hill and the surrounding areas?
No, I don't think so. I'm writing a book about the presidency now called American Monarchy for obvious reasons. And then I've been thinking about doing a kind of capstone book after that called The Rise and Decline of American Exceptionalism, which is going to make a lot of people angry. But I think that's gotten us into trouble too, that we're God's chosen people, that
On the
we're on
hill.
top of the world, we're on the top of the hill, we can do whatever we want.
I don't know about you, David, but I'm God's chosen person.
Oh, you are? Okay.
I was going to say, and what is God's chosen person going to do in retirement? You got to get your travel plans back on.
No,
Yeah,
traveling
well,
is-
that's one. Yeah, that's number one. I gotta get out of this house.
Don't encourage him to travel. It's bad for the environment.
I'll bike, David.
Well, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to our presenters, David Contosta and Bob Meyer, and for the audience and your questions and your time. I just wanted to use this moment to plug the next webinar event, which will be on Thursday, July 30th, also at 4 p.m. And it's by Dr. Nora Madison, who is a professor in the Media and Communication Department at our college, and Dr. Matthias Klang, who is a professor in the Communication and Media Studies Department at Fordham University. And they're going to be talking about facial recognition, people, power, privacy, and the surveillance machine. So I think that sounds really interesting, and I need to figure out what some of all of that means and how it connects, but I'm really looking forward to it. And thanks again to our panelists today and to our audience. We hope to see you again on July 30th. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Thank
Suzanne.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.